An American soldier's screams fill the jungle. His comrades find him with his legs stuck in a hole. The more he pulls to break free, the more something sharp buries itself in his leg, holding him. The rescuers run towards him, but the earth itself opens up to swallow them. Hisses rise from the abyss, fangs ready to strike. These were the nightmarish traps of the Vietnam War. When, on the 8th of March 1965, the US first landed Marines in Vietnam, no one could predict the kind of war they were going to be fighting. North Vietnamese and Vietcong forces, finding a direct confrontation too costly, chose to begin a slow, methodical campaign of terror and attrition. It is in this context that booby traps became the nightmare of every American soldier on Vietnamese soil. Most booby traps used by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were built just like in any other conflict, using some form of explosive, such as shells or grenades. In some cases, though, complex contraptions were produced using simple components available in the jungle. Deadly feats of ingenuity. We still marvel at the most horrifying ones and at the damage they can inflict on the human body. Booby traps were responsible for 11% of American deaths and 17% of recorded wounds between 1965 and 1970, a staggering number in such a bloody conflict. Here's 5 of the most horrible examples. Some traps are feared because of their ability to maim in spectacular ways, a kind of violence we think limited to stories and legends. Some reveal their horror in more mundane, logistical ways. Most of the more spectacular traps require time and skill to be prepared. A lot of work has to be put into digging pitfalls, sharpening spikes, preparing something that will bring its victim to a truly gruesome end. But a simple trap that can be set up in minutes can be left anywhere, anytime. The footbreaker, or cartridge trap, was a feat of cruel simplicity. A small hole, small enough to be done by hand, was dug in the ground, and a piece of wood was dropped on the bottom, with a nail in its center pointing upward. A cartridge of various calibers was then set up on top of the nail, kept in place by a small tube of bamboo. Finally, the trap was covered by a second piece of wood, easily concealed. The little digging needed to slot the trap into the ground meant that almost no trace was left after the setup was completed. Every Viet Cong had easy access to the components necessary and could set up a footbreaker in little to no time, hiding them into future ambush spots, waiting for an unsuspecting American to just step on it, pressing the bullet down on the nail and shooting it into the victim's foot. The result was sometimes fatal and always left the target in pain and unable to move. The rest of the patrolling squad would immediately try to retrieve their fallen comrade and would inevitably step onto other footbreakers or become prey of the ambush waiting for them. A trap that even a child could easily prepare successfully meant that even a path heavily traveled, considered safe, could always be populated by cartridge traps in the blink of an eye. While the footbreaker wasn't the most horrifying trap in itself, and could be seen as pretty mundane in comparison to the last horrible contraption we'll discover, the sheer amount of them waiting on paths, dormant, ready to turn a patrol into a slaughter, was a constant reminder that, as Napoleon said, quantity has a quality of its own. Not all weapons or traps need to be efficient. Finding, trapping, and using poisonous snakes to build traps would be considered, by most militaries in the world, a dangerous and wasteful activity when a simple grenade and a wire can reach the same goal in a more controlled way. The Viet Cong knew this, but understood that fear is a powerful weapon in a war of attrition. Falling in a snake pit was a terrifying fate, mostly reserved for the tunnel rats, American soldiers whose job was to infiltrate the vast, complex network of underground tunnels used by the Vietnamese guerrillas. Snakes, favoring by nature dark and damp places, were naturally attracted to the Vietcong tunnels, often waiting in ambush on their own for a tunnel rat to find them with their hand while crawling forward. Vietcong fighters would take this natural danger and amplify it, often using those same snakes in booby traps. The snake pit was, quite simply, a pit filled with snakes, waiting to strike on anyone who fell into it. The Vietcong often perfected this booby trap by placing the venomous payload on top of the tunnel instead of the bottom, in a hidden compartment ready to open when an unsuspecting American soldier would pull a wire. Fear of such dangerous animals is a common human instinct, and in Vietnam, there are good reasons to be scared of them. The Southeast Asian jungles are populated by some of the most venomous snake species in the world, and Vietcongs would often choose a specific variety of beasts, known to the Americans with the nickname two-step snakes. Two steps were, after all one could muster before the lethal, paralyzing venom would make its way into a man's system. To be fair, while falling into a snake pit could be considered a terrible fate, data from the United States Archives suggests that, in the context of the Vietnam War, casualties due to snake bites were fairly low. Between 25 and 50 US soldiers per year died due to snake bites, an almost insignificant number compared to the horror surrounding it. This data would suggest that these kind of traps were less lethal than one would expect, but their effect on the minds of those who fought in Vietnam can't be denied. Fear was the objective, and it was achieved. In order to maximize the anxiety inflicted on US troops, the Vietcongs turned the jungle itself against them. Every branch could turn out to be a deadly instrument, ready to strike. Any shred of cover taken during a firefight could become itself the reason why a soldier would never return home. The psychological damage, combined with the high level of physical stress of the endless marches, would leave even the best fighters the USA could muster exhausted, prone to make mistakes. The infamous search and destroy strategy, a continuous series of patrols and attacks meant to burn down the Vietcong threat, became a cycle of trauma, damaging both the US Army's ability to function efficiently and permanently scarring the minds of many. The mace was built using a spiked log or metal ball, tied to a tree and secured between branches. The trap was then connected to a tripwire, capable of dislodging the mace from its nest. The ball itself could weigh as much as 40 pounds, making a swing from it easily lethal. These weapons were usually located near helicopter landing zones and tight paths, often traveled by American patrols. When pulled, the wire would release the heavy trap and swing it from the tree directly against the target. The victim would either instantly die on impact due to the sheer weight of the trap, or find himself impaled by the spikes, left as a swinging, horrible reminder of the fate awaiting others like him. Many among the Vietcong forces were apt, if not experts, at sharpening bamboo, allowing these types of traps to cause terrible damage even after a near miss. Weapons such as the mace have an inherent level of psychological warfare. Fast, hard-hitting, striking out of nowhere in a spectacle of mayhem. Fear and horror were not byproducts, but deliberate goals. While far more complex than other traps, the mace could be built by a single soldier, using only materials found in the jungle, given enough time. Sometimes in the absence of better materials, the ball was produced by hardening mud, and both rope and tripwire could be made out of simple vines. A different version of the mace, built based on the same principle, was the door trap. A spiked log would be suspended against the ceiling of a hut and built like a swing. The tripwire was placed right at the door, allowing the trap to fall and hit American soldiers while they surveyed a newly cleared Vietcong camp. The unsuspecting GI was hit in the chest by the log, impaled by spikes, and would often die on impact. When considering the efficiency of such a trap, one has to consider where the eyes of a trained soldier would be while stepping into a door. Eyes adapting from bright light to darkness, darting around, looking for either ambushing enemies or explosive devices. The threat from above, and the tripwire triggering it, could easily go completely unnoticed. Although terrible, a swift death, such as what awaited those hit by the mace, could still be considered merciful compared to the horror awaiting those who fell into our last trap. Simpler than the mace in its production and incredibly easy to hide in deep jungle, the bamboo whip was an example of the Viet Cong's ability to mix a modern, scientific approach to guerrilla warfare with an ancient way of thinking, deeply connected to the jungle and its available materials. This trap was made out of a piece of bamboo, several meters long, often completed by a series of spikes fastened to one end. The bamboo would be bent to its limit and was kept in place by a holding device connected to the tripwire. In some variants, the spikes were swapped out for arrows, turning into a ranged weapon capable of impaling victims from a distance. The bamboo whip was considered one of the most dangerous traps to encounter in the jungle. American soldiers were trained to look for grenades or any sign of human intervention that could signal a trapped area. But a weapon such as this one simply looked like part of the jungle itself. With its vines and branches constantly bent at almost impossible, incomprehensible angles, it was extremely hard to train one's eye to spot the difference between the bent, tense piece of bamboo and the rest of the jungle before someone triggered the deadly strike. Considering the amount of elastic energy released when the bamboo whip triggered, adding spikes and arrows were almost overkill. One hit from this trap was able to shatter ribs and break necks by itself. The intended target of a bamboo whip was, ideally, the point man leading the US troops' advance. These men were usually chosen for their experience, able to spot traps and find the safest possible path. But even these men were often unable to either spot a bamboo whip or jump out of the way after triggering one. Hitting swift like thunder, the bamboo whip had a demoralizing effect on anyone witnessing it in action. Even those who managed to avoid these traps had their morale scarred by simply looking at them. The mere knowledge that these traps were out there caused paranoia in even the bravest of soldiers, who looked around and saw death at the end of each branch. Last, and most horrifying of all, the array of punji traps combined the ease of use, simplicity, and terrifying psychological effects of all previous traps. A punji stick is a simple spike, usually made of bamboo and hollow in the middle, that the Viet Cong sharpened to absolute perfection. These sticks were then used in a variety of ways, some definitely worse than others. One of the most basic uses of punji sticks was to hide them under heavy foliage behind obvious points of cover before an ambush. When the fighting began, the Americans would run, sometimes jump behind obstacles, finding themselves impaled, wounded already by a trap they could not see. While finding out that the ground itself fights against you can be a jarring experience, Viet Congs used punji sticks in far more terrible booby traps. One of the most common ways to turn this from an environmental hazard into a real trap was to set the punji sticks on the bottom of a crate. This was the tiger trap. The contraption was then dug into a shallow hole, resulting in a trap that would leave the victim wounded, screaming for help. These artificial holes were then carefully camouflaged, sometimes closed with vertical swinging doors capable of letting a victim in and close themselves right after. Often, especially during late evening and night operations, even a completely open tiger trap would become invisible to the eye, until it was too late. Smaller, even more advanced versions of punji stick traps quickly became staples of Vietcong guerrilla warfare. A smaller hole, large enough for a leg, was dug and armed with sticks pointing downwards at an angle. When a soldier's leg fell into the trap, no damage would immediately follow. But when he tried to pull it out, panicked, the sharp bamboo would penetrate the skin, holding him down, incapable of escaping, except through more and more agonizing pain. What made these types of traps truly terrifying was the strategy behind it. Punji traps were usually not designed to kill the target outright. The idea was to cause the maximum possible amount of pain, turning what once was a young American soldier into a human bait, calling his own brothers to the slaughter. Vietcong units would lie in wait and ambush soldiers trying desperately to save their comrades. And even when no enemy was around, the chances of rescuers falling into the trap themselves were high, considering how low visibility was where these traps were placed. While instant death was not the immediate objective, the sticks were all but merciful. North Vietnamese forces didn't shy away from using bio-warfare to poison their enemy. In the case of punji sticks, various types of poisonous substances, often human feces, were left inside the hollow center of the weapon itself, ensuring it would make contact with the bloodstream of the victim. One last way to turn war into a nightmare, from which many GIs would never really wake up.